Hello, Ishling. How are you today?
Hi, Purnima. Good, thank you. Good, thank you. Good to be here with you.
Same here. Welcome to the webinar. Welcome to the Glow Heartfulness webinar, Ishling.
Thanks.
For the first timers, GLOW is an acronym for Genuine Loving Outstanding Women. It's hosted by the Heartfulness Institute. GLOW is a series of webinars focused on building a community of compassionately empowered women by connecting with them from the space of the heart. Heartfulness Institute teaches heartfulness relaxation and meditation in schools, universities, community spaces, and places of worship. However, now with the recent pandemic, a lot of things have moved online, and rightly so. We learn to meditate on the source of light in the heart, and we are also going to have an experiential session of relaxation and meditation further in the webinar. So now Aishling Kari is with us here, and Aishling, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Purnima. So my name is Aisling. I'm from Ireland. I live in the US, and so my whole passion, my whole career is about health and inclusion, and health in the broader context of health and well-being, more sustainable health, which is essentially about a healthy lifestyles. And so, as an expression of that, I currently work at the UNESCO chair in inclusive sport, physical education, recreation, and fitness. And I'm also an awakened life teacher, where I teach meditation and various tools and practices to help people to connect with themselves and their inner, their own heart, and radiate that out into the world. And so, yeah, I'm delighted to be here with you and have the opportunity to chat with you, Purnima.
Thank you so much. The pleasure is ours. So Aisling is very humble and modest, and what she missed out mentioning about herself is that along with her team, she's developed a blended training resources called iPEPAS, ipepas.com, and we're going to talk about that also further in the webinar. So yeah, once again, welcome Aisling, and let us begin the webinar. So my first question to you is, what is UNESCO? What is UNESCO chair? And what's the difference between, UNESCO and UNESCO chair?
Yeah, good question. It's nice to start off with that context. So UNESCO, which stands for United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, is actually a UN organization. So, the UN was set up after World War II to create peace and sustainable development and to uphold international rights and human rights. And so, as a part of that, UNESCO is set up and takes responsibility essentially for the educational side of things, the scientific and cultural communication. And what many people don't know actually is that UNESCO is the lead UN agency for physical education, physical activity, and sport, and very much advocates for these activities or all these types of physical activity to create and facilitate peace and sport and peace and inclusion and a better world, essentially. And so UNESCO is the headquarters are in Paris, in France, and they have a global remit. So they've set up this UNESCO chair program and the UNIT Twin, which is like University Twinning Program. And so they have these UNESCO chairs at various universities or higher education institutes all around the world. And each chair has a different, specific task or focus or remit. And so our UNESCO chair in Ireland specifically focuses on social justice, human rights, inclusion, with a focus on disability inclusion, in using disability inclusion within physical education, sport, recreation, and fitness as a vehicle for a more healthy and inclusive world. And so, yeah, that's what we do. So we're also a small team. We work in partnerships. So partnerships is really how all of our work gets done. So we work in partnerships with people all over the world, in various projects and human rights agendas, essentially to really bridge the policy gap, to bridge academia with society as such. And so we've many projects going on, and that's really where the iPEPAS, my project, is very much a project that has been we created to really bridge some of these international policies to make it a reality on the ground. And I'll share more about that as we later in the webinar, as we continue, as we chat further.
Okay, thank you. So that was very nice, the way you explained about UNESCO and UNESCO chair and twin. And you mentioned that, you work with to create inclusivity programs. You also mentioned that sports and physical education is also a very primary part of your work. So I was just wondering, how does sport play a role in inclusivity, or how does sport play a role in human rights inclusion?
Yeah. Well, essentially, well, there's many ways we can look at it. For a start, sport is a human right, and I'll share in a few moments many of the human rights treaties that have human rights or sport referenced, or physical activity even, as within their articles. But when we think of sport in the broader, the role of sport in terms of human rights, even in terms of health. So if we think of health, and for many people, actually, it's not the most obvious. But when we think of health in the broader spectrum, so this image that we have here on the screen is the sustainable health spectrum. And so if we think of the current health paradigm, which is predominantly the treatment paradigm, so you go to your doctor, the doctor will help you to get better, or to get to the point where you're feeling fine, or you'd have no more symptoms. However, that's really not the full spectrum. If we consider that, so there's a definition of health by the World Health Organization that says that health is a state of complete physical, mental, social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease. So there's a lot more than just the absence of disease, that it's actually this positive construct. So it's actually and a resource for life. So it's actually, if we consider lifestyle approach and the value of a lifestyle approach, it can take us much further than just the absence of disease, even beyond prevention of chronic diseases, to actually living a fully flourishing life, or optimal well-being. And so if we were to consider health in that broader spectrum, and even within our health systems, really emphasizing more the role of sport, even other lifestyle approaches like nutrition, stress management, or even, the relaxation response, and other lifestyle behaviors as well. We actually have access to, greater access to optimal well-being inside of that. And of course, health in itself is a human right. Health in itself is a human right. So when we have health as a human right, and then we also have health as, our sport and physical activity referenced in various human rights treaties as well. And so if we consider, so there's, coming back to the UNESCO chair and the work that we do, our specific focus is inclusion of people with disabilities. So in the world, there's 7 or 8 billion people on the planet. So there's 1.5 billion people have a disability, or have some sort of something that affects their functioning in some way in life. And when it comes to their access to physical activity and all of the benefits associated with that, people with disabilities don't have as much opportunity to participate. So, and actually there isn't a huge amount of data, which is very telling in and of itself, that, many governments anyway, don't yet see the priority of or the need for access to physical activity. But, some statistics say that people with disabilities are 3 times less likely to participate in physical activity. Children with disabilities are, some figures say, are 4.5 times less likely to be getting enough physical activity. And then if we consider women with disabilities who experience a double discrimination, or an intersectional discrimination, some statistics say 93% of women with disabilities aren't getting enough physical activity, which is, which is really, it's sad. It's just not right. And especially when we consider, so there's so many benefits to physical activity, but for people with disabilities, they actually have additional benefits. There's the benefits of social inclusion, of having, a way to engage with the community. There's improved, better results in school, even at work. And then even physical activity can actually prevent a lot of secondary conditions that, that often come with some certain disabilities as well. So, when we think of all of these different considerations, it's easier to see why the importance of inclusive physical activity for everybody. And so there's another slide, Purnima, about the human rights as well. So referencing now, I'm not going to go into these in too much detail, but really I just wanted to share this so people are aware of some of, the human rights treaties that do exist, and that each of them actually reference physical activity or sport in some way in certain articles. So we have, the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. That's one treaty, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention of the Rights of the Child, and also, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So these are some overarching human rights treaties that have been signed and ratified by most countries in the world. So in addition to inclusive physical activity being the right thing to do, it's actually also countries and practitioners actually have a legal obligation as well. So that's a big long answer to your question, Purnima. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's a very exhaustive answer, and I very much appreciate the time and energy you put together to collect that data. And it's a very comprehensive explanation. Thank you. I never thought of disability and sports in this context. And also, I never thought of disability and physical activity in this context. It really gives a lot of perspective, and it's food for thought, and it's something which has to be taken action for. So my next question is about the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. Can you talk a little bit about that also?
Yeah, so, a lot of people are familiar with the Sustainable Development Agenda and the goals. So, just for those who aren't, so it's a global development framework that has 17 very specific goals, to really move to a more sustainable world. And these goals, they're very overarching, but the primary aims are to reduce poverty, reduce inequality, and to protect the planet. And so when we consider these goals in relation to the role sport and physical activity can play, again, for a lot of people who aren't operating the sports sector, sport might not be the most obvious mode of achieving these goals, but actually sport can play a very valuable role in achieving many of them. And actually is mentioned in the preamble that sport is an enabler of the Sustainable Development Goals. And, sometimes even to kind of step back a little bit, I know for a lot of the time people, when they think of sport, they're thinking of competitive sport. And that is one aspect of sport, but actually sport is a lot broader than that. Sport is, there's some various definitions of sport, but one definition from the World Health Organization is that sport is, all forms of physical activity, either casual or organized, and that expresses or improves physical fitness, mental well-being, and supports social relationships, and then also does contribute to competitive, include competition as well. So inside of that, and when we think of sport can actually play a much broader role, and when sport is really being capitalized upon and achieving its full potential. So, it can achieve many things, like I've already mentioned, the health and well-being piece, the human rights piece. And sport is really great at community development. women's empowerment. Sport is often used in sport for development and peace, in lots of different contexts, maybe refugees and other causes, other important causes. And actually, sport is also really good at breaking down cultural stereotypes, and that's often seen in definitely in the disability context as well. And so when we consider, so coming back to the Sustainable Development Goals, here on this slide, we've seen, we've highlighted or kept the color in the SDGs that sport is has been acknowledged to be specifically to play a specific valuable role. And for us, all of these, I can mention a little bit about all of them, but the primary ones essentially, especially for me in the iPEPAS program, our SDG 3, good for good health and well-being, for the reasons I've already mentioned, quality education, especially when we consider physical education and the role quality physical education can play. And there's so much research out there now that shows how actually quality physical education is really valuable for and actually supports students and improves their results in other more academic subjects actually as well. And quality education, physical education, is inclusive in and of itself. And so reduced inequalities, again, obviously disability inclusion of all, of all groups, because essentially, we focus on disability inclusion, but we do take a more intersectional approach, that we're acknowledging all of the other people and groups that are typically excluded, whether it be women according to gender or sex, or women in a lot of contexts, ethnicity, socioeconomic groups, and all of these other differences. And the other one that really jumps out at me, and definitely is the whole, SDG 17, so partnerships for the goals. That's one that we definitely is always in the back of our consciousness, because we couldn't be doing our work without partnerships. And even in terms of having anything, any initiative, it has to be relevant to the people on the ground, to the people that it's serving as well in the local community. So all the resources we develop as well, we do our best to ensure that they're contextually relevant, and that essentially they're guidelines that can be adopted and to suit the local needs of whoever is being served as well. And just to say one more thing, about the SDG. So in the sports sector, there's a huge movement at the moment that's probably, fairly, which is unprecedented really. And this movement, so which is essentially being led by the Kazan Action Plan. So UNESCO have developed, there's a framework that's been developed called the Kazan Action Plan, and it's being signed by sports ministers from all around the world. And there's the three fundamental aims of the Kazan Action Plan are sustainable development, inclusion, and integrity in sports. And so the Kazan Action Plan is actually based on the SDGs. It's based on some other human rights and the UNESCO Sports Charter to really bring the SDGs and to really, it's creating this really powerful framework and action plan, really shifting from declaration to action to really bring the SDGs into fruition through sport, using sport and the other types of physical activity as a real vehicle. So that's something that's really, really unprecedented. So there's a huge movement at the moment and a real thirst, and it's really happening. Inclusion is really happening, from policy and into practice right now.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ashling. That was very enlightening, because I use the word enlightening because I could never think of sports as an enabler of the sustainable development. And you even mentioned the Kazan Plan having these 3 action items of sustainable development, inclusion, and integrity in sports. And that was something which really shook me up, because I could think of, food, some food plans or programs rolled out by the government to give healthy foods for children in the schools, or I could think of probably good sanitation for young girls, or I could think of probably education for young girls, or I could think of probably so many other things like climate change, reducing pollution. So I have never thought of sports being an enabler for sustainable development, and that's like, it's really enlightening, and that's something which has raised awareness today about the importance of sports in our life. Thank you so much for sharing that elaborate second slide, which, with the lighted blocks, which had lights on the certain sustainable goals, which sports enables, which this slide is was really enlightening, actually. So
Yeah,
thank you, Aisling.
and I really appreciate your comments because, I know for a lot of people, sport isn't the most obvious. When it comes to health, when it comes to human rights, when it comes to this SDGs, sport isn't really what people, often, like I said, unless you're really in the sports sector, it might not be jumping to the forefront of your mind. And, of course, all of these other initiatives, when, of course, people's basic human needs need to be met. And all of these things can work together. And when you look at the SDGs that sport really represents, it's all of those that are really in relation to people, because we're all human, and once our needs are met, there's, sport can really, it provides a space or an opportunity for people really to connect in a heartful way, in a joyous way that can be really, and there's so much benefits to that, of creating a connection, especially between groups or people who might not normally have had the opportunity to connect before.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. Though, I viewed sports as something which was only fun, which was only optional. Today, I feel that sports is probably a community builder and a community enabler, a joy builder. That's a very nice perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, moving on, tell me a little bit about iPEPAS. How did you, start it?
Yeah, well, iPEPAS is actually birthed from a former project that was developed through, the institute, the Higher Education Institute where I work, the Institute of Technology, and called iPEPAS. So it's the European Inclusive Physical Education Training. And so this was developed, I think, back in 2009, and it was a very successful, award-winning project. And it was time for it to be refreshed, to be updated. And we knew, with this whole movement that's happening on the world, that there's a real need for it. So actually, one of the primary barriers, definitely a primary social barrier to inclusion of people with disabilities in physical education and sport, is actually practitioner training. It's the leading gap that there is, or the leading challenge to be overcome. And so we knew that there was a real need for it, even still. And so, with the whole movement that's happening, also at the UNESCO chair, we knew something needed to be developed. So we looked at, what had been done before. So standing on the shoulders of giants, you could say, with EPIT. So we, started there, and then, incorporated all of the other things that needed to that were available to us. So, we have, obviously, there's a lot of advancements in technology, blended learning. So, and now with a more global remit as well. And so we developed iPEPAS as a way of course, then with the social movement, with the Kazan Action Plan and the SDGs and the human rights. So really bringing all of that into it. So we knew that iPEPAS needed, in its evolution. So we decided to really build it on a foundation of global citizenship education, so that you're really helping to bridge the policy and practice gaps. So there's reference to the policies and the social movement that I spoke about, and the broader role of sport and physical education, and also because for inclusion, we knew that it was really, it was obvious to me anyway, that we needed to bring in some real values-based education in there as well. So inclusive practice really needs to be person-centered practice. And so I decided to incorporate some of the work of Carl Rogers. So if you're not, for people who aren't familiar with him, so he's a sociologist, and some call him the father of the person-centered approach. So he based all of his work on these three core conditions: empathy, authenticity, and unconditional positive regard. And so these three core conditions, I decided to bring them into the resource, to really create that, or to enable or facilitate a real welcome, warm, inclusive environment. Because yeah, of course, the physical environment is really important for inclusive practice, and there's lots of policies. Most people, when they think of inclusion, they're thinking of ramps and the actual physical building. But actually, what is definitely, I think, more important, or definitely as important, is that the practitioners are warm and welcoming. That yeah, maybe everything isn't, maybe if there aren't resources to have the perfect, most inclusive facility, that there's a willingness to acknowledge and to actually connect with the person and address their individual needs, whatever their needs are, and to find the way. When it comes to inclusive practice, especially disability inclusion, there's so many different disabilities out there. So it's and every single person, their disability can express in a different way, or they can affect them in a different way. So you're always going to have to work with the person and find out what they specifically need. And so that's really why I founded the iPEPAS resources on these values, or these core conditions. And so even with empathy, we even took it a little bit further to compassionate action. Because when I started looking into empathy a little bit more, there's different levels to empathy, and compassionate action is really, for me, it's really the heart-centered action. Of yeah, I see you, I'm here with you, and now let's do something about this.
Okay.
So that's essentially. That's essentially. I could go on and on. I've been working on this project for years, so you might need to stop me and divide the conversation a little.
No, that was interesting. Actually, it was not an option to stop. I was enjoying what you said. It was very interesting, and you mentioned the three founding qualities: empathy, authenticity, and unconditional positive regard. It's very good, and as you explained how all this evolved, it was very interesting. But I want to go one step ahead of this, and I want to ask you your personal narrative. Why did you think of doing this, or what was your inspiration to work on this?
Well, essentially, we knew there was a need that was there. The need was there, and coming from my own personal and professional perspective, is that essentially kind of what you're asking, Purnima? Yeah. So my personal and professional perspective, in my education, I studied a lot of the person-centered approach. In addition to the physical activity and the disability inclusion, there was also massage therapy was part of my degree as well, and there was a lot of emphasis on the person-centered approach. And in fact, that was what I was really interested in, even myself, before I'd studied. And even through my practice and the work that I've done, even following my education, and it always just really stood out to me, that anybody working with anybody really needs to have this person-centered approach, and then because really what these, say, even just the core conditions in themselves, what it really is about knowing yourself so that you can be available and know another. And the three core conditions together create a really powerful balance between knowing yourself, knowing the other, and then even having boundaries in relation to that. And it really seemed like a complete package that just seemed like the most obvious way to go. Even through my own inner journey, my spiritual journey, or whatever, through my own journey within, and learning to through my own meditative practice and learning to know myself, and that journey inwards, and seeing how the change that it's had even on me, and sometimes even learning to look at my own implicit biases, the biases, we all have what we know, or our values that we stand by, but then we also have this unconditional programming that we've picked up from our environment, from our families, from our schools, from our churches, or our religious leaders, or the media, that's seeping into the back of our subconscious mind. So it's all giving us these little messages that we take on without knowing. And sometimes there's a conflict between what's being programmed in the back of our minds and what our values. And sometimes that can mean that some of these programming we've picked up, say even for example myself, when I was a child, and some of the things I'd heard as a child, the more charity model of disability was prevalent, of like, oh, poor people with disabilities, and so that was actually when I started my journey in this work of working with people with disabilities. I had to really take a good long look at that, of, oh my gosh, yeah, there is a part of me that has this kind of pity, and that's not in alignment with the person-centered approach. So I had to do, I had to be really courageous and look inwards and acknowledge that and shift it, so that I could really see people for what they really are, rather than seeing them as pity, because seeing people with disabilities with pity doesn't actually empower them or support them in any way. So that's through my own journey inwards and my own self-awareness, and then even my professional and educational journey, it just seemed like the most obvious thing of, we need to bring this into inclusion training.
So, Ashling, my next question to you was about the meditative practices in the field of sports. I know that a lot of heartful practices are being practiced by you, and it's probably part of the iPEPAS program. So, what do you think of the meditative practices in the inclusivity program?
Yeah, I think there's great value to meditative practices, or mindfulness or heartfulness practices. It's definitely a paradigm shift. I think it wouldn't be the most obvious part of training in any sports or physical education training. However, I do think it is a paradigm shift, and I do think the world is shifting towards a more mindful, heartful world. And because I think, and as I was referencing a while ago, I think in any role where people are working with other people, meditative practices are, personally, from my own experience and my own journey with it, I think they're highly valuable, even if necessary, because what meditative practice is, for me at least, is really about learning to know yourself, to becoming aware of the thoughts that you're having, becoming aware of your programming, your conditioning, to becoming aware of your feeling world, your emotions. And when we have that self-awareness, it leads to this emotional intelligence, this self-awareness, where then we can really interact in others in a much more enlightened way, you could even say. And like when it comes to sports practitioners and like anybody working with any people, even in our daily life, there's great value. And even I could say the transformations that have happened in my own personal life, in relating to others through my own practice, but even on a personal or professional capacity, when it comes to inclusive practice, as I was saying, addressing our own internal or implicit biases, that may subconsciously or have us, that have some, even if it's subtle discrimination towards some groups without even realizing it. Or even when it comes to in practice, like working with certain people, having professional boundaries. When we know ourselves, it's much easier to have professional boundaries. Or when it comes to working with children or participants that would have behavior difficulties, this mindful, meditative, mindful approach, or heartful approach even, is really, really valuable, and for yourself and for the participants. It allows us to show up differently. It allows us to respond rather than react, when we have that self-awareness. So I think there's great, great merit in it. And, there is even scientific groundings in this as well, that this approach is really, really valuable. So I thought, why not just bring it into, why not use this, as one of the ways to facilitate inclusion, bring in some of these practices, and in particular the values associated, with core conditions I mentioned, to really create that balanced approach for the person and for themselves.
Thank you.
Sorry, excuse me, and the participants, for the practitioner and the students or participants.
Thank you, Ashling. You mentioned about these founding values, right? Like empathy and compassion and integrity. I was wondering, like, how do you see the future of sports in this context? Because sports, in its own essence, is of competition. There is winning and there is losing. And that's the traditional way you look at sports. I know sports contributes to a lot of SDGs because I just heard you explain it. So I agree. But like, when it comes to the essence of sport or the spirit of sports, it's like, you play to win. Of course, you play with your sportsmanship, you play with a very, positive attitude, but you play to win. So, how do you see us moving from a competitive space to a collaborative space with integrity, with compassion, with empathy? How does empathy play a role here? And yeah, so that's my question.
Yeah, well, and there's so many ways of looking at this. When it comes to even competition in sport. Even when it comes to bringing empathy and empathic practice or compassionate practice into inclusive sport, and it really depends on the context. For in some capacities, like say for example in physical education, oftentimes there's a lot of competitive sport just comes in that that's the way. But competition isn't always uh, very inclusive. But there are many ways, and we cover this in the iPEPAS program, ways to how you can make competition more inclusive, by changing the rules in certain ways, certain adaptations, and just considerations that people may not have even thought of before, because oftentimes the game is the way it is, the rules are the way they are. Um, and in general, competition isn't bad. In competition is it's a natural way of life, especially at the moment on the planet. um, and and there's nothing wrong with competition. Even some people with disabilities themselves are very competitive and like to compete, even if you consider um, the Paralympics, and they're elite athletes with various types of disabilities, and
Mhm.
some of them are some of the most amazing athletes on the planet are Paralympic athletes. Um, and I think when it comes to sport, there'll always be competitive sport. There's always an aspect of sport that will be competitive, and that's just the nature of it. But when we looked, when I, at the broader potential and role of sport isn't always competitive. Um, and I think for me, from my perspective, when it comes to competition, and in sport, and in relation to inclusion, but even in the world in general, I think for me, that it boils down to where the self awareness again, or where is the competition coming from? Is competition can be healthy, but also some competition isn't so healthy, and I think it depends on what is going on with each person, and for us to, and of course that's an individual and a personal journey for everybody. Sometimes I've observed in competition, there can be, when it's trying to fill some need or something inside of ourselves, or when it's more of a contraction, like more of a fear base of,
Mhm.
totally unaware, or at the, people often aren't even aware this is what's going on. But it's like when people are sore losers or get very upset when they don't win, obviously there's some sort of need that's trying to be fulfilled through winning. And I don't think that's the healthiest. Um, but like I said, competition can be very healthy as well. On the other hand, when it's a joyful experience, when it's just a bit of fun, a bit of banter happening, between the winners and losers. And in fact, competition can serve us in many ways too, when it's done in the more heart-based, or the higher form of competition. It can actually encourage growth. Um, but it all boils down to the context, and I think for me, it always boils back to the self-awareness, and the what's really the driving force,
Mhm.
or underneath it all.
Mm. Yeah, that
What
makes
do
a
you,
lot of sense.
yeah, what do you think yourself, Purnima?
I think that makes a lot of sense. Yes. Um, I read this somewhere. I made a note of it, and because I wanted to tell you about it. When I was just, reading on the LinkedIn, I read this. There was an athlete called Abel Mutai, and he represented Kenya in a specific Olympic race. And it seems he was a few feet from the finishing line, but he was confused with the signage which said, finish, or the race is complete here. And so, he just stopped running, and there was a Spanish athlete just behind him, and he could have, finished, and he could have won. But what he did was he stopped running. He explained to this guy, Abel Mutai, and said, "Hey, come, like, you have to run few more feet to win, actually." And he made him win. And then there was a journalist later who asked him, Ivan, why did you do that? Ivan was the Spanish athlete. So why did you do this? And I'm going to read from I actually marked this down. So Ivan replied, "My dream is that someday we can have a kind of community life." The journalist insisted, "But why did you let the Kenyan win?" Ivan replied, "I didn't let him win. He was already winning." The journalist said again, "But you could have won." Ivan looked at him and replied, "But what's the merit of my victory? What would be the honor of the medal? And what would my mom think of me?"
Oh, well, obviously his
I
mom
was,
instilled values in him.
and
Oh,
when I read the last line, "What would my mom think of me?" I was like, I just, that
that's
was
so
cherry on the cake, you know.
yeah,
It really touched me so
that
much.
really addresses what we were what I was just sharing. That the what's the driving force behind the competition. Because it can be healthy, and even in that case, create you know that's a moment in time, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
So, so on that note, shall we have an experiential session of heartfulness, relaxation, and meditation now?
Mhm.
Okay. So I'm going to put the relaxation on the next screen. So for a few minutes, you'll not be on the screen. So sit comfortably and close your eyes, and we are going to have an experiential session of heartfulness, relaxation, and meditation. And just follow my voice. You'll feel relaxed bodily towards the end of it, and then we'll gently slip into meditation.
Let's begin from the toes. Wiggle your toes. Feel them relaxed. Feel an energy from Mother Earth rising up through your toes, through your ankles, rising up through your calf muscles, up to your knees, and gently relaxing them. Your lower legs are completely relaxed right now. This energy is relaxing your upper legs, your thighs. As the energy moves up your thighs, it relaxes your waist, relaxes your stomach, your entire back is relaxing. This energy rises up your upper back, your lower back. Your whole back is completely relaxed now. This subtle energy relaxes your shoulders, your thigh, chest. It's soothing, it's gently relaxing. And this same energy is flowing through your arms, first through your forearms, your elbows, your wrist, palm, fingers, till the tip of your fingers. It's completely gently soothing and relaxing your arms. Feel your neck relaxing now and gently melting away. This energy is moving up and relaxing your facial muscles, your jaws, your mouth, your nose, your cheeks, your eyes, your earlobes are all fully relaxed. Your forehead till the tip of your head, it is completely relaxed now. Your whole body is completely relaxed. Scan your system from top to toe. If any part of your body requires extra relaxation, allow this healing energy to flow and relax that part of your body. Feel your body completely relaxing. Now, slowly, gently bring your attention to your heart. Heart, which is the source of light, source of love, source of all life. There is a source of light in your heart which is attracting you inwards. Let's meditate on this source of light in the heart. As you meditate, if other thoughts come, gently brush them away and bring your attention back to your heart. Let's meditate together.
Gently open your eyes when you're ready. Thank you for joining us, Aisling, in this meditation. Thanks to all the participants who have joined us in this meditation session. For the benefit of the first timers, there will be a few additional resources which will be shared towards the end of this webinar. So Aisling, thank you so much for spending your time today with us and sharing all this useful information. We are very happy. Do you have any closing thoughts?
No, I just want to thank you for inviting me and for the opportunity to not only meditate with you, but also to share, to share about what's happening in the world and what's happening in the world of sport and inside of the context of the broader SDGs and sustainable development. I fully believe that if each of us are really taking action in whatever area or our field is, wherever we have that burning desire or that passion where we know is our life purpose, if each of us are taking action towards that, this new world, this peaceful, more sustainable world is going to emerge through each of us, and we all will meet together in this intersectional way of creating that together. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share, and thank you again for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, the pleasure is mutual. And I'm going to leave us with a wonderful thought which you shared with me. You shared this quote by Nelson Mandela, you remember? A few days back. So I have this here up. Let me put it up. So this says, sports has the power to change the world. It has the power to inspire. It has the power to unite people in a way that little else does. It speaks to youth in a language they understand. So so I think that's it. Thank you so much to all of you for having joined us today.